It is the 14th of March 2021. Good evening. This is Dr. Deepak Natarajan, Senior Interventional Cardiologist, Head of Cardiology, the Supreme Hospital, Delhi NCR. I came across a very interesting article, in fact, a chapter in a book called Agrarian and Other Histories, compiled by Utsa Patnaik and Shurba Chakrabarti. These essays are dedicated to B.B. Chaudhary, another extremely important historian. The chapter by Utsa Patnaik is very interesting because she provides in great detail the plunder, the loot, the thievery, the pillage, the marauding by the English for as long as 2 centuries in the Indian subcontinent. The method was very simple. The taxation was very high. For example, a peasant would be taxed 100 rupees. If he were to sell his products, such as, let's say, cloth or rice, for 50 rupees, this was sold to an agent of the British Empire. So what was happening was the money was being paid back to the Indian from his own money, and therefore there was no economic growth of the Indians. And also, if there was any export of any product, if this was sold to a foreigner, the foreigner had to pay to London, either by gold or silver or by his own currency, and he was provided council bills. This bill he would present to the exporter from India. The exporter would present that bill to the local colonial house, and he would get his money in Indian rupees, which was considerably less than what he had sold at. And so therefore, once again, there was a clear-cut scam, there was an embezzlement, and this carried on for 200 years. It began in 1765 with the result that it seems the English embezzled, or rather, frankly, just brazenly stole as much as 19.2 million pounds across these 200 years, which is about $45 trillion in today's money, by adding the 5% interest. And this scam has never been elaborated upon, either by English historians and even not by most Indian historians. So the result is that most Indians and even a lot of English people do not realize the thievery which went on for 200 years. Now, this is very important to bear in mind because Western propaganda is so sophisticated, it is so highly evolved, that even after 200 years of rogering the Indian subcontinent, the average Indian still feels privileged that he got rogered by the English. He still feels that the English did him a favor by stealing his money and leaving him staring at abject poverty. As people have already mentioned, our contribution to the world's GDP was as high as 25% before the English appeared on the subcontinent, before the East India Company began its operations. And by the time the British left in 1947, our contribution had fallen below 4%. Now, this was the scale of the loot which has never been seen before on the face of this planet and which has never been repeated after this, right? But we are made to believe that they were doing us a favor. In fact, the situation is so shockingly scandalous that the average Indian, regardless of the fact where he comes from, whether he is a businessman or a journalist or an academic, the average Indian even today craves for approval by the Anglo-Saxon or by the white man. The Indian craves for adulation, for admiration, for just basic acknowledgement of what he is doing. The result is that even if there is a brown-colored Indian expert on any issue, he would be disregarded. And the opinion of the Englishman would overwhelmingly overrule the Indian opinion. Now, this is particularly in context with the COVID-19 pandemic. I have been saying repeatedly in my previous segments that you have to be very careful of what is being provided to you, the information which is provided to you, whether it is the BBC, whether it is the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the London Telegraph, the London Times. They all have been providing massive propaganda for the last 1 year. And as I mentioned just now, that the propaganda is so sophisticated that you have been overwhelmed, at least I have been overwhelmed by the atrocities committed by the Nazis, which were definitely done. There is no doubt about that the Nazis went about killing 6 million Jews in gas chambers, that the Soviets killed their own people, killed Russians by the millions in their gulags, that the Japanese had their own atrocities which they committed on the South Koreans and the Chinese and also the North Koreans. This is all on record, but we have been bombarded by these bits of history, by these atrocities, and by these cruel acts committed by the other peoples of the world. But somehow what was done in India has been largely submerged by a very sophisticated method of camouflage. For instance, in 1943, most of us now know that there was this Great Bengal famine. This was actually man-made. This was not because there was no rice, but the rice that was produced was shifted for Allied troops under the specific instructions of the then English Prime Minister, who was Winston Churchill. And as the wheat or the rice which was being taken out from Bengal, the price of rice was skyrocketing. As a result, the local people could not afford the rice. They were then not in a position to purchase rice. The result was that they were starving, and this starvation led to the deaths of about 3.5 million people. This is only 1943. In the year 1770, apparently 5 to 10 million people died because of starvation. Again, because of a famine then. Now, I don't know the details of that famine, but this famine in 1943 was largely man-made. And even when the local administrators informed Churchill that what was being done was very dangerous, Churchill's retorted by very petulant markings on the file. I mean, there was absolute nonsense which he wrote, suggesting that Indians deserve this, that Indians breeded like rabbits, and of course that infamous question, has Gandhi died yet? Now this of course was abominable, and this was rather not done, let us say in simple English. But the fact remains that most Indians and even most Englishmen are not aware of the cruelty which was inflicted upon the subcontinent. And I don't want to go into the details of the Great Partition. I have mentioned that in a book which I wrote about 5-6 years back. The Great Partition again accounted for almost 1 to 2 million deaths. There were about 10 to 15 million people displaced. There is no point going into the gory details as to how many women, the thousands of women who were captured, who were assaulted. I don't want to go into those details, but somehow that dark bit of history has been rather diluted, if not completely submerged by the sophisticated English press. Now, there is no question of reparations by the English. There is no question of apologies by them, because they're just too thick-skinned. And in fact, a lot of them still believe that the colonies, that their imperialism helped not only them, but also their subjugated subjects, which of course is absolutely incorrect. What actually happened was that by this money which was being stolen systematically from the subcontinent, the English had their reserves at a very high level. They were able to provide capital to other countries like the United States, which were building roads and railroads. This money went into the building of infrastructure in Canada, in building of infrastructure in Australia. So in fact, most of the English world was made by money which was extorted from this country. So how do we react? I'm not a politician, I'm not a historian, and therefore I do not demand any reparations or apologies, but not in a lighter vein, but being very specific, I wish that the Indian team smashes the English cricket team in the current T20 series, and I would suggest that they make sure that the best pace bowler, one of the best pace bowlers in the world, is included in the team, that is Bumrah, and apart from him, of course, the best white ball player in the world, that is Rohit Sharma, is included in the next game. We have lost one game, we have won one game. We have discovered the new boy, that is Ishan Kishan, who again plays for Mumbai Indians. But apart from that, it is imperative that Rohit Sharma is compelled to play in the next 3 T20 matches against the English. That's my small prayer to the BCCI and all people concerned. But all of you must understand that we were rogered and by the English. For 200 years, nobody has done that to any other country, because at the most, the Nazis operated for 6-7 years, not beyond that. And so it was with the Japs for a few years, 3 or 4 years, not for 200 years, right? This is very, very important. Now, I keep harping on the fact that the propaganda or the misleading reporting is so well developed by the English media, in fact by the Western media, because a lot of times you get the wrong signals about COVID-19. So let me come back to COVID-19. Despite what is being mentioned about the variants in various English and English-speaking news channels and by English and Western newspapers, the fact remains that the study which I spoke about in my last segment, which was from the La Jolla Institute of Immunology from the University of California, which is still a preprint. This is a very, very elegant study, and this is a brilliant study, because this clearly shows that T cells which have been produced by previous corona SARS-CoV-2 infections or by the immunity produced by the Pfizer vaccine, these T cells are effective not only against the wild or the original SARS-CoV-2 virus, but also against the 3 variants, against the English variant, the South African variant, and also the Brazilian P1 variant. Apart from this, we have now clinical data. The best data is again from Israel, which has managed to inoculate more than half of its population, and the results are staggering. We find that symptomatic infection has been reduced on the ground by as much as 97%, and asymptomatic infection has been reduced by 94%. So we have an efficacy of 94% for asymptomatic infection, and we have an efficacy of 97%, 96% against mild symptomatic infection. Also, despite the fact that the AstraZeneca vaccine was not found effective in 2,000 young South Africans because they carried the South African variant, we have a preprint now which was posted about 3-4 days back, which has data on the AstraZeneca vaccine in hamsters. Now, in hamsters, it has been found that when they have been vaccinated by the AstraZeneca vaccines, then if they are challenged by the South African variant, the pulmonary pathology is almost non-existent. Now, this means that even though the AstraZeneca vaccine is not very effective against mild infection, it will be quite effective against serious infection. And this has also been shown on the ground by the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, which is a single-shot vaccine, and the vaccine can be kept in a fridge for 6 months. That has shown an efficacy of 64% against the South African variant. Now, I have mentioned this earlier, that this SARS-CoV-2 virus has a genome of 30,000 numbers or 30,000 alphabets or 30,000 bases or 30,000 nucleotides. The maximum number of mutations have been only 25 or 26. That means even now, the variants are similar to the original virus by 99.7%. The change has only been 0.3%, which is not enough to make it a different strain. We still have variants of concern or variants under investigation, but we do not have a variant which is so different from the original virus that it produces a different clinical picture. Therefore, my humble submission to you is that despite what is being discussed in Indian television or what is being discussed in the BBC, CNN, NBC, or whatever, or in French newspapers, please understand that even though we have these variants, we have these numerous new variants, they have not been able to increase the mortality figures. In fact, you all know by now that admissions to hospitals are plummeting in the West. They have gone down as much as 90% in England. That means above the age of 80 years, people, the admission is below, is as low, has come down by more than 90%. A similar situation is also being seen in the United States of America. The reason for that, of course, here is that, and the situation is also the same in Israel. The reason here, of course, is largely that a large chunk of people have already got infected and also a substantial number of people have got vaccinated. So the combination of natural infection and vaccination is contributing to some form of clinical equilibrium, which also implies that there is some form of herd immunity. We are also seeing that in India, that since the mid of September, cases have been declining rapidly. Admissions into hospitals have also declined, as also has been the death rates in India. Now, there is a small surge which is being seen in the recent 1 or 2 weeks, but this is not because of any new rogue or a new dangerous variant. This, I think, and it is seen on the ground, this is because of human behavior. People are being reckless, people are being careless. You can see it on the streets of Delhi tomorrow morning as these hundreds of thousands of people will go for their work. You will see that most of them are not wearing masks. If they are wearing their masks, the mask is down, slipped on their chins. There is no distancing being maintained. People are sitting in cycle rickshaws barely a millimeter apart, or in cars barely 3 inches or 6 inches apart. So therefore, this could be the reason for the small surge, but there is no drastic increase in mortality, nor is there any drastic increase in hospital admissions. The number of people who've died in Delhi yesterday was just, I think, 1 or 2. The number of new cases has, of course, gone up from 200 to 400, but this is a small surge. These new numbers of cases, which we are seeing now, are because there are still quite a few people who are susceptible to the virus, who have not been infected earlier, but the combination of previous infections by different cold coronaviruses and infections by this SARS-CoV-2, and also now that the vaccination program has begun, the combination will definitely lead us to herd immunity. Now, the level at which herd immunity is seen is not the 85% or 90% figure which is being provided by Western epidemiologists, especially by Tony Fauci. I think the figure is much lower. The figure should be around 60% or even 55%. Now, keeping that in mind, in Delhi, which has a population at least of 20 million, of these 20 million, almost 60% have developed antibodies. Even if there are false positives, we still have around 12 million people infected in Delhi. The number of deaths in Delhi even today is less than 11,000 people. So that gives us an infection fatality rate in Delhi of just 0.09%. Now, that is nothing to be alarmed about. The reason is simple, as I mentioned, either there is prior immunity or there is the simple fact that the Indian population is very young. And also it has been seen that the number of deaths below the age of 65 years across the planet are not more than that seen by serious influenza, and the number of deaths above that age are also not very much higher than seasonal influenza. This is about the world, but in India, our figures are far much less than that seen in the West. Now, people may talk about, a second wave or a third wave or a fourth wave, or they may also talk about the Ides of March, or they might say, look back 100 years to the pandemic which came in 1918. But that, I think, is a very, very unfair comparison. In fact, that is a stupid comparison, because in the year 1918 and 1919, despite the fact that 50 million people died, or maybe 25 million people died, or 100 million people died, the fact is that our ancestors, the people living then, had no idea as to what was happening around them. There was no information. There was very little knowledge as compared to now. Let me tell you now that at that point of time, even when the pandemic was over, all the big doctors in the United States of America and in Europe had no idea that the cause of that pandemic was a virus. They kept believing right till the end that it was a bacteria. They even gave the name to the organism. They called it the Bacillus influenza, or they gave it the name of Bacillus pfeffer. Pfeffer was the German scientist who proposed that maybe a bacteria was causing that pandemic. Also, we had no antivirals at that point of time. In fact, why antivirals? We did not even have antibiotics to handle the superimposed bacterial pneumonias. The hospitals had no X-ray machineries. There were no CAT scans. There were no MRIs. There was no PCR test. There was nothing then. There was no idea of immunology. There was a very primitive idea that yes, bacteria existed, that yes, there were some viruses, and again, there were no vaccines. People had used inactivated vaccines then against certain bacteria. People were using anti-sera. They were using antibodies produced in horses for diphtheria, and even for tetanus they were using anti-tetanus serum. But there was no systematic program. There was no systemic program for producing vaccines, because there were no vaccines, and they had no idea. They did not have any idea of the DNA. Nobody had seen a DNA. Nobody knew the structure of a DNA in 1980. Nobody even knew. Forget DNA. They had no idea of what is RNA. So therefore, we are now in a far more better position. We are far more secure. We know that there is a virus. We know the virus is an RNA virus. It has a plus polarity. We know it has 30,000 letters. We know that monoclonal antibodies work against this. We know that antivirals such as remdesivir can shorten the infection rate. We also know that an anti-parasitic drug called ivermectin can possibly reduce the viral load and can also reduce mortality based on randomized studies, albeit however small. We also know that severe cases can be tackled significantly by a simple drug such as dexamethasone, and then we can add upon dexamethasone, we can add tocilizumab, which is an interleukin 6 inhibitor. We also know that famotidine can help. We also know that oxygen, simple administration of oxygen can help. We also know that keeping the prone position can help. So therefore, we are now in a much, much better position. But what has to be kept in mind is that the precautions have to be maintained. We cannot have funeral functions with hundreds of people being invited for distribution of food or lunches. We cannot have marriage parties going around for 3 or 4 nights, right up to 3 o'clock in the morning, people collecting in the hundreds, all embracing one another. That will not do, because then that certainly will add to the number of cases. But the important thing is that we now live in a much different world, and in the coming weeks or coming months, we may develop other medicines also which can combat this virus. And apart from that, we will have better vaccines. We will have second generation vaccines. We will have third generation vaccines, and these vaccines will also be effective. We also have a preprint from Denmark, which has now shown, as also the Israelis have shown, the Danish have also shown, that after the second week, after the second shot of the Pfizer vaccine, the efficacy is as high as 90 to 94% in people who are young. That means in people who are in their 40s with a median age of 47 years, and the efficacy above the age of 84, 80 or 85 is as high as 64%. So we have information that vaccines work. India makes the maximum number of vaccines in the world. So therefore, the combination of natural infection and a good vaccine rollout should ensure that this pandemic is tackled in the coming few weeks or in the coming few months. And I'm quite confident that we will get back more or less to how we were living before this pandemic set in. Now, if you have liked this video, please do press the bell icon. Please do press the like icon, subscribe this channel so that I also get the inspiration to make more videos for you. If you have a comment, I request that you put down your comment, and I will end this talk by saying that I have no bitterness against the English. I have no enmity against the English. I am not here asking or demanding reparations by them. I'm not demanding any apologies by them. But I want every Indian cricketer who plays international cricket, he should be told about what happened while we were colonized, while the imperial forces were in play over here in those 200 years, wherein we were robbed of almost $45 trillion. That is a huge amount. That is 15 times or 17 times more than the English GDP. And therefore, I would want that at least we beat the English in their own game. Thank you very much.